BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Well, today, right now, we are going to be discussing the Zodiac Killer hoax theory, but I have to say, first and foremost, that this is intended to be the final segment of our playlist that we're going to put in place after our interview with Thomas Henry Horan, who is, of course, the author of the Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 86, 69, as well as the entire compilation series, The Myth of the Zodiac Killer. But if you haven't heard that interview yet that we did, I highly encourage you to check it out, but you can keep listening, because we're mostly just going to be discussing the Zodiac Killer and a very big theory about it. But once again, this is intended to be the final segment to the playlist. Okay, though, what can we say about it? Well, overall, I'd say that there is a little bit of clarity that has been shared, and, somebody once told me that when I was discussing Thomas Henry Horan, I jumped into the subject a little bit prematurely. And no one wants to admit something like that, but yes, indeed. If you had asked me, prior to our most recent discussion with him, what is the Zodiac Killer hoax theory, I would have said that it was, that there were a series of murders that happened in 1968 and 1969, and that someone from the San Francisco Police Department's Narcotics Division covered it up by creating the Zodiac Killer persona to protect the confidential informants of the Narcotics Division. That this was something that was created by an individual named Hal Snook, who wrote the Zodiac Killer letters, as a way to get the media distracted from what actually happened so it wouldn't jeopardize the actions of confidential informants. And Hal Snook wrote the letters, and Robert Graysmith, the most famous Zodiac writer that out there, was also the person behind writing the ciphers. And there are a few examples for this. Graysmith's name is found in the 408 cipher if you arrange certain letters. Very, very nutshell version of that. So Hal Snook and Robert Graysmith would be working together. Okay, though, it turns out that all of that seems to be true with Thomas Henry Horan. However, only the first two incidents in Zodiac activity, Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs, would fall into that category. Lake Berryessa and the Paul Stein murder of Presidio Heights are rather different. The explanation provided is, of course, that somebody named Dennis Land committed the Lake Berryessa stabbing of Cecilia Ann Shepard and Brian Hartnell. Cecilia Ann Shepard passed away. Brian Hartnell survived. Dennis Land was a park ranger who actually rescued Brian Hartnell, and that was the motivation for the Zodiac Killer hood with the symbol on it. He committed the stabbing, and then he left for 30 minutes, changed his clothes, got cleaned up, and came back to the crime scene later on, as well as completely destroying evidence so that he would not have known. He would not be able to be traced back to him. But then Brian Hartnell survived. He can talk about this. Lots of eyes began to fall on Dennis Land, and the reason why the Paul Stein murder happened is it was a way to get people to stop investigating Dennis Land. We aren't even necessarily sure the motivation about why Paul Stein was chosen specifically. There are many, many hypotheses out there, but that's a big thing to note. Only the first two incidents in Zodiac activity would have been connected to the confidential informants of the SFPD Narcotics Division, as well as some other things. I'd say a big takeaway is that the Zodiac letters were mailed 25 years to the day of when Hal Snook should have received his World War II medals. He was supposed to get 4 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart, and when he tried to receive the physical medals, they said, we have no records of this, so every mailing of the genuine, authentic Zodiac letters are matching up with Hal Snook's military service. I'd say that's another big takeaway. I mean, that's a coincidence we can't ignore. That's not something you could say, well, maybe it just happened that way. But really, I would like to give a big shout out to the YouTube user Postmark, who suggested that I interview Thomas Horan on the channel. The reason why I didn't do it sooner is I thought that perhaps Thomas Henry Horan would not want to come on a channel like this. It's very small, very few subscribers. But then I thought when someone suggested it, I was like, okay, let's just contact him and see what he says. Because this is a small channel, at first I offered him money to come on the show, and he turned it down. He said he didn't want it. He said he simply just would come on and talk to me about the Zodiac Killer. And he also said on the Stones Unturned podcast, his show, that he sells the books for $2.99 because he wants people to read them. He wants to put this message out there and to connect with people and have discussions like this when you have people discussing the Zodiac Killer hoax theory. Okay, so we've kind of set some of the framework, that there were a group of individuals that planned this. We don't have all the answers. The first two incidents, Lake Herman Road, would have been perpetrated by an individual named David Ott, or perhaps his cousin Russell Ott. One of those two people could have been the shooter at Lake Herman Road. Blue Rock Springs, the second incident in Zodiac activity, which saw the murders of Darlene Ferrin and the shooting of Mike Mageau, would have been done by either Jim Phillips Crabtree, Darlene Ferrin's ex-husband, as well as an individual named Donald Warren Porter. They could be involved with that. One of those two could have issued the fatal shots that killed Darlene Ferrin. And then, as we said, Dennis Land would have committed the Lake Berryessa stabbing. As for the murder of Paul Stein, we see that it could be Hal Snook himself, or perhaps a Jordanian immigrant named Hesham Syed. And there are some conflicting things about that. I'd have to say, though, after talking to Thomas Henry Horan, the big things that go against his theory are by his own admission. He isn't sure how all of these things are linked together. Because I was like, what about the relationship between Robert Graysmith and Hal Snook? For this theory to work, they would have had to have been working together. If you're going to say that Robert Graysmith's name is found in the 408 cipher, though then, and he's the writer of the ciphers, possibly. I mean, it's a possibility, but he would have had to have been working with Hal Snook. And what I believe Thomas Henry Horan is promoting, or what I believe he wants to say, but he doesn't have the proof yet, is that Robert Graysmith and Hal Snook knew each other when Graysmith was a kid, and that Hal Snook was Robert Graysmith's mentor for everything, pretty much a lifelong mentor. But what I would say is that, we're waiting until we can find the proof for that. That is something that's unproven. About that, though, I began to notice something. We were talking about Arthur Lee Allen, and his pseudonym in Robert Graysmith's book Zodiac is what? Robert Hall Starr. And when I even said this during the Zodiac hoax uploads that we did last year, Star, okay, star sign, that's another name for the Zodiac symbol, right? Star, Zodiac, all right. He probably gave him that name because of that. I could see that very easily. My first instinct, anyway. But then we also talked about how Bob Starr was, I just don't like the pseudonym Bob Starr. I thought it was cacophonous. But Thomas Horan, during our interview, referred to Robert Graysmith as Little Bobby back when he was growing up as a boy. And then I began to think, wait a second. I know this is absolutely far out, but I just never even thought twice about it. Robert Graysmith, Robert Hall Starr. They both have the same first name. And then I began to think, well, is there any meaning in this? How does Hal Snook become connected to this? Robert Graysmith, Robert Hall Starr. Hal Snook, Hall Starr. H-A-L, H-A-L, it's both in there. It's almost like a signature. And I Googled that, and I was trying to see if anyone else was writing that on forums or something. I didn't see that come up from anyone. I wrote to Thomas Horan himself, and I was did you ever talk about this, that this could be like a signature for Robert Graysmith writing the ciphers, Hal Snook writing the letters, and then Star, of course, meaning Zodiac. Robert Graysmith, Hal Snook, star sign, and star sign is, of course, another name as in Zodiac. That was just something that I thought about. Is that even real? It's a possibility. And this is the thing with the Zodiac Killer hoax theory. It is all in possibility. There really just isn't a lot of definitive certainty that we can use to unite all of this together. And Thomas Horan says very clearly that he's trying to find the pieces that will certify this. It's a little bit difficult, and it will take some time to get some records. But what he responded to me was, he had never written about how Robert Hall Starr could be a signature for Robert Graysmith, Hal Snook, Zodiac Killer. What he said instead was that Starr, Starr, was the name of a road near where Darlene Ferrin lived, and that was where Donald Warren Porter was. Once again, the person who possibly could have murdered Darlene Ferrin, either Jim Phillips Crabtree or Donald Warren Porter. But what do we got to say about this? I'd say a big challenge, though, is that, first and foremost, Thomas Horan likes to discredit Robert Graysmith's credibility, saying that he changed his name, he uses a pen name to write his books. If you're a nonfiction writer, you lose all credibility to do that. That's not something a journalist should do. And the thing I tried to press him on, and perhaps it didn't come out that well, was very simple. Robert Graysmith didn't use a pen name. That is his legal name. There's a little bit of a difference between changing your name legally and just using like a fictitious pen name. And all he did was push his middle name and his last name together. His name is Robert Gray Smith Jr., and he pushed Gray and Smith together to become Robert Graysmith. I still stand by my original claim that he didn't want to put Robert Smith on a book. I mean, can you think of people named Robert Smith? Can you think of any famous person named Robert Smith? I mean, I can already have two coming to mind, as well as one South Park caricature. But the thing is, though, it's like, there's a little bit of a difference with that. And furthermore, if it's inappropriate for a journalist or an investigative reporter to change their name, Robert Graysmith was not a journalist, and he was not an investigative reporter. Thomas Horan says very clearly he was a production assistant at the San Francisco Chronicle. He is very famously referred to as a cartoonist, which he indeed was. But, I mean, Thomas Horan was like, his primary job was a production assistant. So, I mean, he wasn't a journalist or an investigative reporter of any kind on the Zodiac case officially. I mean, of course, he went on to write his book, which he started in 1972, and I still think that Horan really gives him too much credit in saying that every documentary you've seen in the last 30 years is based on Robert Graysmith. I don't accept that because we have access to so many primary source documents, and on the majority of things that we discuss on this channel, talking about the letters, the ciphers, talking about, yes, lots of theories, but even when we mention the Zodiac Killer film from 1971, it's like, as well as a lot of the first-hand statements, like when we did the transcript reading from Brian Hartnell for the 50th anniversary of Lake Berryessa, that's not from Graysmith. That's from the source documents. I don't really accept that every documentary and every book since 1986 is based on Robert Graysmith. And furthermore, here's a big thing. In this Zodiac Killer hoax theory, Thomas Horan doesn't say there was no Zodiac Killer. When I was first approached about this, it was actually by somebody in the comments section on a different Zodiac Killer upload talking about there was no Zodiac Killer, it's all a hoax. I'm like, what are you talking about? And, of course, there's Zodiac Killer. If anything, we have the Lake Berryessa stabbing where someone's out wearing the hood with the Zodiac symbol. And even in Horan's theory, that's exactly it. There was a Zodiac Killer. His name was Dennis Land. He was somebody who made the Zodiac costume, put on the Zodiac hood with the symbol, which he could have learned about from the newspapers, which was published August 4th, 1969 in the Vallejo Times-Herald. On the front page, that symbol was available. So even if it wasn't Dennis Land, it could have also been somebody who had been a copycat. Many people have talked about this. People have left comments on the previous Zodiac Killer uploads saying that this could have been a copycat. Everything about Lake Berryessa is different. It was a stabbing. It wasn't done with gunshots. The perpetrator wore the hood for the only time, the clip-on sunglasses, tying the victims up, having conversations. It really doesn't seem like that was the same person. But now, we gotta say, though, when we say that Dennis Land was the Zodiac Killer, in Horan's theory, also, possibly, he does say that Hal Snook could have committed the murder of Paul Stine. So that goes back to what we call the group murder theory, that some people arranged this together. But a big piece that is just missing is how. Who, what, when, where, how, and why did that happen? And I even asked him about that. Well, what's the relationship then between Robert Graysmith and Hal Snook, and did they advise Dennis Land to commit the Lake Berryessa stabbing, or did he do that on his own? And Horan's very clear when he doesn't know something. He doesn't lie. He doesn't make something up and say, well, this is what had to have happened. No, he just said, I don't know, I'm not sure. So we're waiting for those details. But that was a big takeaway that I had coming from this whole thing, is that very clearly, I mean, the way I can imagine this, let's just say this, because Horan doesn't want to speculate, I can because this is the far off corner of YouTube. When I hear that, the way I would have imagined it, even if you just think that this is some fictionalized scenario, Hal Snook and Robert Graysmith meet up with Dennis Land. He's like, hey guys, guess what I did? They're like, Dennis, what did you do? And then he's like, I committed a stabbing at Lake Berryessa and I was wearing the Zodiac killer hood. And then they were like, Dennis, you idiot, you almost ruined the whole thing. You could have exposed us. You could have done something crazy. Or you could have ruined this entire thing and we could all go to jail. So 2 weeks later, they commit the Paul Stine murder to cover it up. And this could also be one of the reasons why there isn't a lot of Zodiac material in the letters talking about Lake Berryessa when there are countless letters about Paul Stine. I mean, not countless, but multiple letters address the Paul Stine murder. And Horan believes that that was done to take the pressure off of Dennis Land so that he wouldn't be implemented in the Lake Berryessa stabbing. And then he said that's the biggest reason why he was not arrested was because he had an alibi for the Paul Stine murder. These are two incidents in Zodiac activity. Oh, well, clearly this guy isn't the Zodiac killer. Now, we're already getting some comments coming in about the interview we did with Horan. And someone was saying that they can accept that Hal Snook was involved with this. They can accept that Hal Snook could even be at the center of this. I don't have that comment in front of me or else I'd give you a shout out. But it's like, Horan also tries to tie this into some other bigger things like the Manson family, the Son of Sam, MK Ultra. And if you're asking me, is it somewhat plausible that it started out as a Zodiac killer hoax, that Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs, I always do that. Lake Herman Road, December 20th, Blue Rock Springs, July 4th happened, and then they created the Zodiac persona, and then it really took on a life of its own. Dennis Land commits the stabbing, Hal Snook or Hesham Syed committed the murder of Paul Stine. I mean, that's not implausible. What I would say, though, is, do I accept that all of this was done so that Hal Snook could communicate with a CIA operative in Thailand and Cambodia by sending them the San Francisco Chronicle, which would have had the Zodiac ciphers printed on the front page, which contained a coded message that is tied into the Manson family, MK Ultra, and the Son of Sam and the Zebra murders, all saying that we shouldn't sell tainted heroin in the United States of America? This batch of heroin is going to be tainted. These people are going to be ripping us off. That this is all just a masquerade for the drug trade, that the CIA is involved, and they're doing these criminal activities. The Manson family, Son of Sam, the Zebra murders, the Zodiac killer, MK Ultra. It's all done to kind of, with connections to the heroin trade. It's like, it's so messy. With the skeptic card, when you play the skeptic card, you do not say that somebody is wrong. You simply say that I'm waiting for the proof. And I'd say that Thomas Horan has really shed a lot of light on the subject, but I asked him, though, why not just say that Hal Snook was the Zodiac killer? Multiple people have written in the comments section saying they believe that Hal Snook was the Zodiac killer. Other YouTubers have done uploads saying Hal Snook was the Zodiac killer. And I asked him that, and the response that I thought was, I mean, it's expected. He's just like, that would be fine, but I don't see the physical evidence to connect him to the crime scenes. All right, we've thrown out some challenges. We've thrown out some big things. I mean, a lot of people say that this is a very complicated theory. I would say yes, especially when you tie it into the other events in America in 68, 69, and the early 70s. It can be complicated, but I do insist. If you listen back to our Great Zodiac Killer Hoax playlist that we started last year and completed at the beginning of February in 2020, one of the claims that I did make is, when you go point by point, you can actually see that sometimes Horan's explanations are simpler. It doesn't mean I agree with everything he says, but some of them are simpler, like all of these things about Darlene Ferrin receiving mysterious packages from Mexico. What's the explanation for that? Oh, well, that didn't actually happen. Graysmith falsified it. Well, that's all for me now. If you have anything to say at all about this, please drop a comment below. I would love to hear from you. If you like this upload, you can hit the like button. If you want to challenge the Zodiac Killer hoax theory, please do it in the comments section. I want to hear from you. Challenge this. Say what you want to say, and let's discuss this a little bit more. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button so we can talk more about the Zodiac Killer and some other true crime cases. And until next time.